So we're going to continue our discussion on variables and expand upon it to something called a parameter. So let me show you something very simple. System.out.println, oops, hello world. Close it off, and when we run our program, we expect to see hello world show up in the console, and we do. Now what if I put in something simple like hi Bob? Do we still expect hello world to show up? No, we expect hi Bob to show up. Whatever value we put inside those brackets, that's what we expect to show up. Well, this println command, or print line, it has an expectation. Its expectation is that when you call this code block, that you as a programmer will supply it with the data it needs to do its job. Just like if we were to do something like this. Let's create a variable, let's say double result. And we're going to set this equal to math.pow of 2, 3. Now that's a base of 2 and an exponent of 3, so we should expect a value of 8 to show up. So let's display that, system.out.println. Now you notice this time we're using println again, but instead, inside, I'm going to display the result. Of course, run this again, and we get hi Bob, and we get 8.0. So no matter what I put in println, I'm going to get that on the screen, even if it's a variable. What's going to happen is Java will jump over to the RAM and say, hey, what's the current value stored in this result variable? It will retrieve it, and then it will pass that into the println command, so println knows exactly what to print on the screen. Similarly, when we look at math.pow, it's expecting two pieces of information, a base and an exponent. If I put my mouse over top of the pow command, you can actually see in the little description, I just hit F2 here, that it's expecting two doubles, A and a B, where A represents the base of the power and B represents the exponent of the power. It requires both of those. Well, this information, this data that these blocks of code, println and pow, require to do their job, that's what's called a parameter. Let me just write that word out for you. Parameter. And basically a parameter is a local variable inside that code block that we give it information when we call the subprogram, or when we call the code block. So when I call println, I'm saying copy hi Bob into its version of the variables. Just like when we moused over pow here, so it has a double A and a double B. That means it's going to copy the value 2 into A and copy the value 3 into B. And then we don't know what's going on under the hood, but we do know that we're going to get a result back, and that we are going to store inside of the result variable. So these parameters are local and temporary variables that store copies of the data that we pass in. The purpose of a parameter is to give the subprogram, or to give the block of code, exactly the data it needs in order to do its job. If we don't give it that data, it will complain. So for example, if I just do math.pow, but I only give it a base, immediately we see an error show up. If I put my mouse over, the method pow double, requiring two doubles, and the type math is not applicable for one argument, which is an int. That's going to give us a problem. So we have to supply it both. Not only that, I have to do things in the right order. If I switch these around and instead of having 2, 3, I have 3, 2, that's going to give me completely different results, because instead of 2 to the third power, I now have 3 to the second power. So if I run it, I get 9 now instead of 8. So not only does all the data need to be supplied to these code blocks, but it needs to be supplied in the proper order. Sometimes it may not just be a problem where we get the wrong results. Sometimes it may be a problem where we completely crash the program. Like what if I accidentally put in, I don't know, the number 3 or the word 3. It's expecting a double, but I'm giving it a string. So if we go over here, we see, oh, we're expecting a double, but you're trying to give me an int string. That's not what I expect. I'm not going to do my job. That's what the POW does. It says I want exactly what I want. If I don't get it, I refuse to work. Similar with the print line. So these parameters, one more time, are local temporary variables that store a copy of the data that we give it to it when we call that code block. So I'm calling these code blocks right here and saying, do this work please. And we see I call print line in multiple places in the program. I can call it as many times as I want. And depending on the data I pass in, I'm going to get different results. Imagine having a calculator where all you could ever do was 2 plus 2. It'd be a pretty useless calculator. So these things are similar. They're blocks of code that do the same thing every time, but they do it differently based on the data that we give it as parameters. Notice that I'm only giving it the base and the exponent in the POW. I don't also give it the result variable. That doesn't make any sense because I don't need to calculate result. What I need to do is just give it the information it needs to calculate the result, and then it will give it back to me, which I store it inside the result variable. So parameters, local temporary variable, used to, they're a piece of data that is required for the code block to do its job. All this information is required, otherwise it won't actually do it. So if we call a code block but we don't give it the needed data, it's probably not going to compile. It's going to crash and say, sorry, I can't do this, I'm going to give you a syntax error, I'm expecting something, you're not giving it to me. It's like a contract between the code block and the programmer. The programmer promises to supply the code block with everything it needs to do its job, and then the code block says, yep, I'll do it, you gave me everything as promised, here's your work, I'm done. And then it gives back our result or displays on the screen whatever it is supposed to do, whatever that code block is meant to do. So that's it for parameters. In our next module, we're going to take these two concepts of scope and parameters and apply them in a much more useful way.